So thanks very much for having me, and that's just shaved off 3 sentences from my speech, so that would be quite good for timekeeping. I wanted to start with a quick introduction about who it is you're listening to. So I guess you can probably tell that I'm white. Less obvious is that I'm heterosexual. I live in Oxford. I come from a relatively middle class, although background from a working class family. And I spent 15 years working in international development, and as Flo said, I now coordinate the Mindfulness and Social Change Network, and I teach at the ulex Centre, which is a centre for activists, and do other sort of consultancy work relating to inner and outer change. So why am I telling you this? Well, I guess because I think it's important that we start these conversations acknowledging where we're coming from, acknowledging our labels, acknowledging the identities that we have, acknowledging our experiences, because what I'm going to say to you about wellness or about well-being is going to be different from what you might hear if you were listening to a black woman, or if you were listening to somebody who was lesbian or non-binary, or came from a different class, or had a different background than I do. So I don't have time to explore the backgrounds in this room or who we have here, or the different identity, locations and experience that you all come from, but it might be nice just to start with something where you do some thinking about well-being, what it means for you. So I wondered if we could just take a moment just to have to ponder a relatively neutral and hopefully not too challenging question, which is, how much of your time do you invest in your well-being? So if we think we have like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, have a think to yourself, roughly what percentage of time do you think that you invest in your well-being? And maybe I'll have a shout out from 2 or 3 people. What percentage would you say? Audience participation. That's a scary thing. Hey, I'm the one doing the talking here. You just have to shout out a number. So, you know.
What percentage or how many hours?
Percentage.
5.
Depends on the week. 5?
Yeah.
Per week? 5. Any advance on 5?
10.
30.
30? Okay.
Probably 40.
Okay.
I'm doing quite a lot of things.
Okay. Great. Okay. So I guess the question which I would encourage you to kind of think about while I speak is that enough? Is the percentage that you've given enough? Do you feel like it's enough for you? Do you feel well because of the amount of well-being that you're doing? Do you feel that that is supporting your groups and organisations to do well? Do you think that is helping us to have a well society? That's just a question to kind of keep in mind. So personally, whenever I see the word well-being, it tends to be some kind of yoga retreat or detox smoothie that if I drink, well-being will come. It's typically a white woman, typically these yoga retreats and other wellness activities tend to be quite out of the reach of many of us. But I think that that's kind of important to start with, because other than that being a gross prioritisation of white people, it's also an orientation towards the pleasure of well-being, an orientation towards the easy. It's a sort of well-being light. It's a sort of consumerist view of well-being. I'll buy this and I'll be well. And I'm afraid my talk is not going to be that. And I'm a little bit nervous about going first, but you'll get to hear from 3 other people afterwards, and they'll talk about lots of great ways that we can achieve well-being, and hopefully that will be reassuring. Mine's a little bit more about the why than the how. So I guess I wanted to start with a question. So what if, in fact, well-being was not actually that tasty? What if it wasn't actually that easy? What if it wasn't actually that immediately appealing? What if it was harder, more challenging, more diverse and more political than we tend to think? What would that mean? And so I guess I have 3 kind of ideas. One's about wholeness, one's about energy, and one's about interconnectedness. And then I'll say something about mindfulness at the end. So let's start with wholeness. So when I say wholeness, I mean like learning to face, acknowledge and integrate our whole selves. Parts of ourselves that we like, parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily like. So when I teach meditation, one of the early discoveries that people tend to have is how much they actually don't like what's going on in their mind. People don't want to be silent because they don't want to hear what there is to hear. We are a lot more judgmental than we think we are. We have a lot more bias. We have fears, we have vulnerabilities. We sometimes aren't the good people we think we are. Sometimes we can find out that we're actually quite selfish, and so on and so forth. So of course, doing meditation, which is why we all do it, there are lots of wonders to experience. Calmness inside, kindness, spaciousness. But of course, those parts are easier to be with. But what about these other sides? What do we do? In my experience of teaching mindfulness, being around the mindfulness movement, what we tend to do is we learn to mask, push away, deny, reject sides of ourselves that we don't like, that we find difficult. So any side of ourselves that does not align with the view that we have of ourselves, or the view of how society wants us to be in order for us to be valued. So how much of our energy is used up just dealing with the inner self? And again, that's kind of another question for you. We talked about how much time we invest in well-being, but how much of our time do we just need to just deal with ourselves? So this pushing away, often unconsciously, of parts of ourselves, on the contrary to making us feel better, actually takes up energy. It's not a passive process. And when we are able to see our whole selves, to hold it all, to acknowledge it all, when we've found the tools and emotions to support us to do that, we can become more integrated. And this is really what real well-being is, in my view. But now, how much energy would we think we would need to invest in order to achieve that type of well-being? If we wanted to achieve that, how much time and energy would we be willing to put in? So what I guess I'm talking about in part is self-acceptance. So when we say acceptance in the mindfulness view, everybody goes, oh, acceptance means resignation, or acceptance means not being active, it means passive, and that's not what it means in this context. So when I say acceptance, I mean an acceptance of just acknowledging the real starting point, where we really are. Then we can grow and change, and we can flourish a lot faster if we acknowledge our real starting point. And as social change actors, which some people in this room, many of us perhaps are, not only do we have our inner challenges to reconcile ourselves with, but we also have all the outer ones. So we want to tackle the big issues, the human species level challenges, climate change and racism. So how well do we have to be to do that? Not even just to look after ourselves, but how well do we have to be really resourceful and transformative to tackle those big issues? So I'm going to give you a quick example. So at the moment I'm doing a lot of work on whiteness. So I'm learning about my white privilege. I'm understanding how I have internalized racism, how I have developed typically white defense mechanisms when being called out or challenged, recognizing that doing work on whiteness is a choice that I get to make as a privileged white person. And I could go on. But I wanted to give this example of how working on integrating one's whole self, even parts, and perhaps especially the parts of ourselves that give rise to the most discomfort, is a vital part of radical well-being. And it takes time and effort, but it's vital for making the types of social change that we want to bring about. So this might seem a little bit counterintuitive, because we think well-being is something that will make us feel happy, or something that's meant to bring us joy, a treat, have fun, and for sure there is a place for that too. We need to cultivate joy and happiness and lightness. But if we want to be deeply well and create a society that is deeply well, then we need the kind of well-being that allows for us to be more open, to face difference, to be more creative, to be more responsive to feedback. And so this is where I come to my second point, which is that well-being is essentially about energy at the end of the day. Sometimes I feel it gets sort of dismissed as a sort of nice to have, but if we think about what the opposite of well-being is, the opposite of well-being is sick being. It means being depleted, it means being unable to perform as usual, it means struggling, it means being stressed. When we're not well, there is more potential for us to be pushed around. There's more possibility for others to have power over us, to influence us, to harm us. When you're stressed, your executive functions are affected. You don't make as many good decisions as you might do. You don't have as much capacity to do that. You have chemicals running through your body which put you into a state of hypervigilance. You're more prone to habitual behaviour, and these can be often maladaptive. Drinking, smoking, they'll have them on it. Looking at those beers right now, and they look very refreshing in this heat and the challenge of doing a talk to people. But when we have energy, when we are well, when we can make good decisions, then we can develop creative strategies. We can make decisions in a collective and participatory way, which is really, really difficult and takes a lot of energy to do well. Really, we need the full use of our faculties to make good decisions, to make use of and invest our resources, to decide who to collaborate with, to to explore complexity, to transform systems. We need to be the most well that we can to be able to tackle the challenges we face and not replicate or reinforce them. So being well, therefore, is about being able to give. It's not just something that we get, it's something that we can offer to other people. It's that we can transfer energy and we can create conditions for other people to be able to have energy. So it's actually an act of generosity to have our own well-being. It's about, we keep ourselves well, then we can have a healthy system. So it's about learning how to store, share and transfer energy so that it isn't leaked or wasted. So I was thinking in this case, well-being is a little bit like walking along a tightrope. You know, in order to walk along a tightrope, you have to hold something and you have to be constantly adjusting and making small movements. And you have to go quite slowly. But at the end of the day, you've got more chance of getting to the end. It is a more efficient way of moving. And if we're falling down regularly because we're burnt out, then that takes a lot of energy to get back up and start again. So this brings me on to my third point, which is about interconnectedness. So G, who is the director of ulex project and ecodharma, has a phrase that we use on the collaboration course, which is we need to know our inner triggers like we know our phone numbers if we want to work through the challenges of group working and collaboration. So if we don't know our triggers and haven't worked out how to be well with the realities of those triggers in place, then we spend a significant amount of energy in conflict, in fighting, in protecting our egos. And this is where it gets more challenging. We know that radical well-being has to be pursued beyond our own well-being and to the creation and sustaining of well-being for all, yet we are naturally more likely to be driven towards self-protection and defensiveness if we haven't done the work of understanding our inner pain, our inner sensitivities and our vulnerabilities. So the tendencies we see across social change movements is for well-being to be deprioritised at best and at worst criticised or judged or mocked. We take beyond individual to mean not individual. We confuse individual with individualistic. We confuse self-care with selfishness. And this makes creating collective cultures of care and well-being really difficult. And therefore we miss the chance to do the work that needs to be done to bring our whole, authentic, grounded and wisest parts of ourselves to our work and to our collectives. Audrey Lorde extends her concerns. She's a black writer and civil rights movement activist. She extends her concerns about the critique of well-being or self-care into the political. Many of you may have heard this quote. She says, self-care is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. In fact, she goes on to say, she goes on to talk about the risks of the anti-self-care culture, saying that when a society is already providing for you and protecting you, then you can reject self-care as indulgence. So well-being, in short, well-being I feel is hard, long, deeply transformative and an empowering journey, and it's an active process rather than an ideal one. It's a political one rather than apolitical. It's multidimensional rather than the same for all. It's about uncompromising wholeness and integration, and it's about creating, saving and sharing energy. So I'll just quickly say something about mindfulness in the last 10 seconds. There are many activities you could do to be well, and I didn't really want to talk about the activities because I don't think it's that hard to find them. I think it's more hard to convince ourselves that it's worthy to do it. But there's lots to mention, and they're all important. But what I think mindfulness does have to offer as a particular type of exercise or practice is a tool that specifically helps us to notice our perspectives, the lenses through which we understand ourselves in the world. It's specifically designed to cultivate and sharpen and sustain our awareness and our attention, and it supports us to cultivate emotions that support us to do what often the long, hard and challenging work of well-being is. So we teach these courses at ulex, and I'm happy to stay behind and talk about them afterwards. I teach mindfulness and social change, collaboration courses, regenerative activism, as was mentioned. So I just wanted to end with one last quote, and thinking about, as we said at the beginning, the risks are large and the potential is really great. And there's an African proverb that I heard once that said, "The situation is urgent, let's slow down."